Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Scott Kane. For those of you who don't know me or we haven't met, I am the state E-rate coordinator for Kentucky from the Kentucky Department of Education. I am joined by my partner in chaos, Caprice Caprice Robinson. I get that right. You learn somebody's name and then they go and change it. Caprice, thank you for joining us. I think we also have a handful of our KETS engineers online with us as well. Today, we're going to take some time to look at the procurement process around renewing your WAN contract. That is, that your contracts that provide for internet service and data transmission. Actually, I should say data transmission service from the KETS hub down to individual buildings within your district. There are some important nuances that are a part of that process. And so I felt like based upon some feedback that we received last year, some folks really thought that it would be helpful to have a session that just deals specifically with that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and dive right in, and I'm going to save you the wear and tear on your eyes, and you will no longer have to look at my face, and we'll give you a look rather at my screen instead. Let's see here if I can get this right. There we go. All right, so you should see my screen now. If you don't, Caprice or somebody, you could just let me know. You see it? Okay, good. Excellent. Excellent. Okay. As mentioned, I want to talk today about your WAN contract refresh and the E-rate processes and some of the particulars with respect to that. Without belaboring the point, we'll just dive right in. We're going to take a look at the eligible fiber-related and network-related services and charges, what is eligible, what is not. We'll look at installment plans, and although we won't talk about state match funds because there are no state match funds from state of Kentucky at this point. We'll look at the Form 470 a little bit, and we'll talk about RFPs associated with that. We'll talk about evaluating the cost effectiveness of the bids that you receive. We'll look at some service delivery related items with respect to deadlines and extensions. And we will look at what role your service provider can play with respect to your Form 471. We won't get into the details of the Form 471 today. Really, our focus right now is going to be on the procurement side of things rather than on the requesting funding side of things. But that having been said, we will take a look at what the service provider can do to help you in preparation for your filing your Form 471. Before I go any further, I do want to say that if you have any questions, you can feel free to jump right in and ask them if you'd like. Just say, hey, Scott, I've got a question. More than happy to take them that way. You can also drop them in the chat in Teams and submit them that way. And as usual, Caprice, I'll ask you to just jump in and let me know that there are questions in the chat so that I can address those as they come up. I would encourage you, we will have some time at the end to do some questions and answers, but I do want to make this as iterative as possible. And so if you have any questions in the middle, don't hesitate to ask them then. You don't need to feel like you need to wait till the end of the session. I will do my best to try and keep it to somewhere in the neighborhood of an hour. I know I tried to do that last time, and I think I was about 20-25 minutes over. So I will do my best to keep this as condensed as possible, but the content is pretty thick, so it may take a little bit of extra time beyond that. And so when we look at eligible E-rate eligible transport, that is data transport, there are three main components or three main options for that. There are some others that we will talk about when we discuss the self-provision networks, but For the most part, we're looking at three different angles approaching this with respect to fiber. You have three different options. You have leased lit fiber, you have leased dark fiber, and you have self-provisioned networks. Leased fiber is basically you're talking about a company that comes, you're contracting with a company that comes in and they install, they take care of, they manage, they oversee all of the traffic that and the communications that take place over that. They own they own any equipment that might be necessary to make that connection work. And the E-rate applicant pays basically a monthly fee that's associated with the cost of that circuit. In leased dark fiber options, the applicant leases perhaps a number of circuits or a specific number of strands on a network that is owned by a fiber provider. But the applicant, that is you, would be directly responsible for lighting that. So they don't provide you with equipment to make sure that that runs. They don't monitor that system. They don't oversee, traffic and make sure that things are up and running as they should be at all times. That is something that is associated with leased fiber, but dark fiber, lit fiber. I should be careful with that. Lit fiber. So dark fiber, you are responsible for much more of the process, but as often the case, when there's less to be done by the service provider, you have a lower cost associated with that service. Last but certainly not least is a self-provisioned network. This is the term that USAC has adopted to refer to a network or network infrastructure that is owned by you, the district, the applicant. So you own the fiber, you hire somebody to come in and build it and construct it and connect it. And then you are responsible for acquiring the equipment that's necessary to light that. You are responsible for maintaining that network. And if anything goes wrong with that network, you are responsible for fixing it. Because, as I mentioned, you own it. Your district is the owner of that fiber. Once again, that's an option that in some instances will provide some cost savings. And we'll talk about the costs associated with these and how that relates to E-rate here in just a moment. It is worthy of note, and it is a very, very important note. And I say that because sadly, we've recently had a district that was denied for this very reason. And that was that when you go to request a self-provisioned network, that request must also include seeking support for technologies other than fiber, such as fiber optic, or excuse me, not fiber optic, but coax, cable, microwave, copper. You must be willing to at least accept all of those other transport options in addition to fiber. So that is, as I mentioned, a very, very important thing. Oops. Okay. So you as the applicant may request E-rate support for monthly charges associated with leased lit fiber. Also with leased lit fiber, you can request special construction charges and basic installation charges. That is the limit. There is no opportunity for you to obtain network equipment or management of your network under a leased fiber contract. That's primarily because, at least on the maintenance and operations side of it, that is included in the cost of that leased lit fiber. When it comes to dark fiber, what's eligible is the recurring fiber the payment for the leasing of that set of strands that delivers the communications. You're also eligible to receive funding to support maintenance and operation of those segments of your network. Special construction charges. So if something needs to be built out in order to put that dark fiber in, that is included, as well as basic installation, and under leased dark fiber, network equipment as well. And then on the self-provision side, you have full costs of maintenance and operations charges and special construction and network equipment. Obviously, under a self-provisioned network where you own it, you are not going to have a recurring payment that's associated with that particular line that you are putting in place. Make sure I double that. There we go. So with leased lit fiber, what was eligible as far as the transport is concerned is a fiber-based broadband service where the service provider owns the network, manages the network, and you pay the fee for it. Oops, I went too far, didn't I? There we go. There we go. I didn't mean to repeat myself. So when we talk about special construction, I mentioned that just a moment ago. We're talking about charges up front for building a network, putting the pieces in place, trenching or stringing fiber off of telephone poles, et cetera, et cetera. Those are considered to be a part of that. Special construction charges eligible for Category 1 support consist of 3 components, as you can see there: construction of the network, design and engineering, and then project management. So basically, we're talking about what's associated with just building the network itself. And then you may seek funding for special construction charges in connection with a leased lit fiber, leased dark fiber, and self-provision network. So special construction is eligible under all 3 options. Special construction charges do not include charges for the network equipment. That is something that's separate. And network equipment, as mentioned, is only eligible under leased dark fiber or self-provision networks. Also not included are the maintenance and operations of that fiber. Somebody to make sure that there's monitoring, that it's operating correctly, that there are no cuts or disruptions in service, issues with latency and problems associated with those kinds of things. Fixing those are not included in special construction. If you are seeking bids for network equipment and or maintenance and operations related to your leased dark fiber service, bids for these services must be requested on the same Form 470 as your leased dark fiber service. So you need to make sure that your Form 470 includes all of the components of the project, not just you want to make sure that you don't separate your 470s, so you have multiple 470s that are associated with the same project. It is required to be all on that same 470. And then funding requests for network equipment and maintenance and operations costs associated with lighting, leased dark fiber must also be included on the same Form 471 that requests the support for the dark fiber lease. I'm not going to get into the IRU. It's an indefeasible rights of use, which is basically like a lease anyway. So it's a very, very rare sort of situation. I think there are some legalities to it that are a little bit different from a standard dark fiber lease, but they are very similar in terms of the arrangement and how those operate. You can incur special construction charges up to 6 months prior to the beginning of your funding year. In other words, January 1. So you can, once you've gone through the procurement process, you've gone and you've put your 470 out on the street, you've gotten your bids, you've selected your service provider based upon the most cost-effective option, and that has occurred. Let's say that has occurred very, very quickly, and perhaps you got a response back, or you filed for that as of I don't know, let's say April 12th. You can go ahead and begin your construction process even before you have received a funding commitment from USAC. That having been said, you'll note that on the bottom it says applicants that start construction early before a funding request is approved. you assume the risk that the request will be denied or that a reduced commitment amount is approved. In other words, you take on the possibility that you may end up possibly having to pay the entire cost of your project out of pocket without E-rate support. So generally speaking, most folks will wait until there is um, a funding commitment decision that has been handed down by USAC on your Form 471 before folks will get started. That having been said, in some cases, there may be things like building projects and whatnot where you simply decide, you know what, we can't wait. We're going to have this one way or another. And so we're going to go ahead and move forward. That is an option as well. But as I said, you need to be sure that you are aware, and perhaps other folks within your district, your other decision makers within your district are aware of those conditions as well. The actual service start, that is when you start paying monthly charges for your leased, lit, or your dark fiber, that actual service can only begin, and you can only pay for those services after the start of the funding year, as of July 1. So if you had your special construction completed in April, if you choose to have that lit up and operational prior to July 1, just know that your monthly charges associated with that will be, you will have to cover the cost of those yourself. They will not be eligible for E-rate support because they did not occur within the funding year that you've requested the support for. They do have the option to make milestone payments, to submit invoices for special construction charges at any point during the funding year. But note that you may not receive E-rate support for any recurring charges, as I just mentioned a moment ago, before the start of the funding year. Sometimes, the service providers will want to get payment for the construction prior to services starting, or for example, they meet a certain point in the project and you have to pay 25% of it. I'll use the example of kitchen renovation that we did a few years ago here at my house, and we had to, once demo was done, we had to put in 10%. After the cabinets went in, we had to make another payment. So that kind of thing can be done under the special construction, and you may submit an invoice for that special construction at any time during the course of the funding year. So to be eligible for E-rate discounts for special construction charges, no matter which option you're choosing, it must be completed in time for the fiber to be lit, or for your self-provision network to be operational by the end of the relevant funding year. In other words, if you applied for special construction to be a part of a project that begins July 1 of 2024, that special construction must be completed and you must light up your fiber, your connections, prior to June 30th. Otherwise, those special construction charges will not be eligible for support under the program. That is also something that is important to be aware of, because that may be impacted by the construction, the ability of the service provider to meet those deadlines. You can also have installment payments. It's kind of similar to the milestone payments, only you're just basically amortizing over the course of a few years the total cost, so that it's not incurred all in the same year. You can request them on your Form 470, but make sure that if you are interested in having that as an option, that you must indicate that you are interested in an installment payment option on your Form 470. There's a There's a checkbox that you just simply check off that says, yes, I'm interested in installment payments. And presumably a service provider that is willing to offer those will respond in kind. But be aware that your service providers do not have to offer that installment payment plan. It's just an option that, if both parties agree, can then be implemented. If a service provider chooses to offer an installment plan, they must disclose all material terms, including the interest rate and the term of the payment plan. Interest rate, if there is any. Presumably there would be if you're going as far as 4 years into the future. And note that interest and finance charges are not E-rate eligible. So anything that is on top of your base pay, your principal amount, that total cost of the actual installation and the construction, anything above and beyond that in terms of interest or finance charges, you must cover yourself out of district funds. All right, so seeking bids by submitting your Form 470. Obviously, just as with any other E-rate supported project, the way that you begin the process is by submitting a Form 470 in EPIC, the E-rate Productivity Center. That is nothing different, but it is a little bit different in how the drop-down menus operate in terms of what you select in the Form 470. I think at this point, yeah, okay. So when you're looking for leased fiber, or leased lit fiber, excuse me, I need to be very careful with that. If you are looking for only lit fiber, in other words, you don't really want to take care of lighting it up, you don't want to do the maintenance and monitoring of it, you really want just somebody to give you an end-to-end turnkey type solution. If that's all you are interested in, you may do so by posting an FCC Form 470 in EPIC that only specifies leased lit fiber as the requested service. And I'll show you a little bit of a demonstration here in just a moment in terms of what that looks like in EPIC. But that's all that you need to do. And the least lit fiber option, I will say this, from an E-rate perspective, is by far and away the easiest process to go through. So that may be a matter of your consideration. I don't know. I would think that there would probably be some other overriding factors that would be probably more important. But from an administrative point of view, and in terms of E-rate, least lit fiber is the easy option. When it comes to least dark fiber, the program rules require that you consider both dark and lit fiber at the same time. In other words, you will file your Form 470, you will fill out a request for service indicating the number of circuits you're seeking on a lit option, and then it will ask you for some additional information about dark fiber as well at the same time. So it basically will help you fill out a service request for both of those options at the same time. And certainly not last but not least, the self-provision network. If you are looking to own your own fiber, and I know that is a solution that a lot of folks tend to be quite interested in, particularly for smaller runs, shorter distances, perhaps on the same campus, extending service to a new location that's next door, things like that. You, in that case, must also request bids for services provided over the third-party networks. Now, what they mean when they say services provided over third-party networks is essentially you must entertain the bids for least lit fiber and least dark fiber, as well as your self-provision network, and then you will go through the bid evaluation process to determine which of the options that's been presented to you by the service provider is the one that is most cost effective for you. And we'll talk about some of the considerations as far as cost, cost efficiency, cost effectiveness in just a moment. All right. I'm going to take a real quick side trip, and we're going to look at that Form 470.
Yeah, I'll just jump in just for a second, just stress that
Please do.
point you just made, Scott, because it is something that I run into quite a bit with districts where, say, for example, you've got a high school and middle school on the same campus. Literally, they're adjacent buildings, or maybe they're even connected. Well, that fiber between those 2 points that you want to upgrade, you can certainly do that with a self-provisioned 470, but you do have to ask, as Scott mentioned, for leased options, even though there's like no realistic reason you would ever want that. But just think of it this way, from USAC's perspective, they don't know if it's 100 feet away or 100 miles away. So we've got to show that you've done your due diligence and that truly this self-provisioned option will pay for itself in no time, comparatively speaking. So it's the most reasonable choice. Same thing that you mentioned earlier with, you may know just because of personal preference that you want leased dark fiber, but legally they make you ask for leased lit fiber. Scott and I have talked behind the scenes for years. We feel like USAC definitely assumes that fiber's all over the country and they don't want to have to use federal money to run any new fiber. So it seems like they've got a bit of a bias toward paying for leased options that are already out there, which they think are just available everywhere. Maybe they've never been to rural Kentucky and they don't realize that it's not just 5 competitors with fiber on every pole. So
good observation, Jody. Thank you. You'll note that it asks as soon as you indicate that it's going to ask if you have an RFP, and we'll talk about RFPs here in a minute. The only time you do not need an RFP when it comes to your WAN contract is if you are seeking only lit fiber. Okay, so anytime you're looking for dark fiber or dark fiber or self-provisioned, you will absolutely have to have an RFP. It's not a bad idea to have an RFP or at least some sort of document that, even for lit fiber, that details where the service needs to go, your expectations in terms of speed, the locations that are going to be served, any important considerations that might have to do with somebody bringing in a new service to that location, or to bring it in from a satellite school into the school that has the CAN-RAC in it. It cannot hurt to provide your potential bidders with as much information as possible so that they can give you the very best bid that they can, and hopefully that will then result in the best options for you when it comes to evaluating your bids. I just use this as a placeholder so that we can move on. If I indicate, yes, here there's an RFP, and I don't upload something, it will not let me move on to the next page. So I'm just going to throw that in there for now and hold that spot. Then it's going to ask any of the RFPs that apply to all of your new Category 1 services. We're going to select that one and continue. All right, and we're going to move on to adding a new service request. This is where we start getting in our, yes.
We have Corey with the question in chat.
Okay.
He is asking if there are any recommendations for doing a fair cost comparison for leased fiber versus self-provision.
Yes, and we will get into some details about that further on. So I'm gonna, if you'll forgive me, I'm gonna defer the response to that question for now, and then we will talk about that later. And then if you have any more, perhaps more specific questions when we get to it, feel free to ask again, if that's all right with you. I hope that's not, I don't want to feel like I'm blowing you off, because I'm really not. We are going to talk about evaluating bids and some of the key elements of evaluating bids between, and when you start doing that cross comparison, it's not an apples to apples necessarily comparison. So there are some steps that need to be taken to sort of even those out, and we will talk about those. But it's a really good question. So we start with we're seeking bids for internet access and or data transmission. We're going to start with that. And then it gives us a number of different options. If you are seeking, if you're seeking bids for internet access and data transmission service, like a fiber only network, fiber, non-fiber, hybrid, cable, DSL, copper, satellite, microwave, your response would be the first one. In most cases, you're probably going to be looking for fiber only, although, as mentioned, if you are looking for if you are requesting a self-provision network, you must at least entertain the bids that might be hybrid networks or non-fiber networks as well. That having been said, I think in most cases, what you are going to be requesting is either you're seeking to purchase data transmission service only, which will allow you to then request, note it, and this then will allow you to select one of two. The first one, I seek data transmission service without internet access service. That is basically going to be the same as asking for least lit fiber, okay? So this first option is the least lit. If you want dark fiber, you would select the second one. And note that when you request or when you answer that question, it then brings you to, or it brings up the place where you're going to enter the number of circuits that you are requesting. If you have, for example, 5 satellite buildings, you might say 5. It says unit strands. So, oh, that's dark. I'm sorry. I was thinking about the quantity on the least lit. On the lit side, yeah, you might be looking for 5 circuits. And then it's going to ask you for it's your minimum and maximum speeds. If you know that your minimum might be 1 and your maximum might be 10, or maybe it's 50 or something along those lines, I would encourage you on this least lit side, when you're asking for minimum or maximum capacity, I would encourage you to make that range fairly broad so that you get a number of different options and you get pricing for a number of different options. Specifically, that's important because with least lit fiber, you're probably paying, at least in part, what you pay is going to be based upon the speed of the service. If you only request a single speed increment, you're only going to get, in all likelihood, you're only going to get a response that gives you the pricing for that single speed, which means that if you ever wanted to upgrade your speed, you would have to go all the way back to the beginning of the process and start asking for, you would have to go back out to bid. Okay, if the contract that you receive gives you pricing for only a single speed, you are stuck with that single speed until the end of the contract, or you have to go back out to bid in order to obtain services, faster services. So that's an important note. On your lease dark fiber, you're going to indicate how many strands you are looking to lease. So if you have 4 strands, if you're looking for 2 pair for each building and you've got 5 buildings, that would be a total of 20 fiber strands. Now, what I haven't shown you yet here is what this looks like if you want to build your own network.
Those drop downs, by the way, are good reminders too, like of some things to put in your RFP. Like if you're asking for dark fiber, make sure you say how many strands you're after at locations. If you're asking for least lit or you're or you're forced to ask for lease solutions, make sure that you put your minimum and maximum speeds and detail that in your RFP as well.
Good point, Jody. Good point. Yes, thank you. So when you indicate that you are seeking the self-provisioned option, and I'm going to emphasize that word option, even though they don't really mention it here, is they are going to then ask you for the quantity, and this now it says for the units is each, and this is going to either correspond to the number of you might. I think in this case, I would use the number of buildings that you're wishing to connect. The reason for that is what I mentioned earlier, is that if you ask for a certain number of strands, you are basically demonstrating a preference for fiber. And that's the key thing that you can't do on a self-provisioned network. You have to be willing to accept bids for the other variety of networks that are out there that might be able to provide that service. As mentioned before, DSL, microwave, cable, etc. So I would recommend here indicating the number of buildings that you seek to connect, and I would do the same thing over on the third-party networks. So you have 5 here, you would have 5 here, and then once again, you're going to submit your range of speeds that you are interested in obtaining. Here we go again. What's with another, and then it's going to ask you if you are seeking installation, activation, and initial configuration for this service. My recommendation here is always to say yes. And the reason for that is that just because you request it doesn't mean you actually have to purchase it. That having been said, if you didn't request it, well, you can purchase it, but you're going to pay for it in full. USAC E-rate will not support that if you didn't ask for it here right now on the Form 470. And then we save the request. It's going to mention once again, you must request for bids, that are for both the self-provisioned and services over third-party networks. Be sure that your minimum and maximum needs are laid out. It also mentions that your narrative and your RFP, the narrative does not have to be particularly elaborate if you are submitting a thoroughly constructed RFP. Just say yes here, and then it brings us back, and you note that it actually created for you 2 separate service requests, only one of which ultimately you will be filing for. But you have to request all of the different options, and then do your due diligence in your procurement, in your bid evaluations. Note here that it does suggest a couple of things that you would want to include in your narrative. If there are any automatic disqualification factors, if you have a particular date by which you require that bids be received, make sure that you put that in here. If you have any disqualifying factors beyond that, if they fail to address a particular aspect of things, or if they can only do a portion of the project, you're looking for someone who can do the entire project at once. You're looking for somebody local or something like that. Well, I wouldn't go with the local. That's bad. That's a really bad example. But if there are any elements that would result in automatic disqualification without being without you doing a bid evaluation on what you receive, you want to make sure that those are listed here. Also, details about locations, et cetera, those kinds of things are probably going to be in your RFP. I would encourage you to put them in the RFP, but you can also put them here in your narrative as well. And then again, on the self-provision side, I would encourage you to make sure that you do not say that you have a preference for fiber. Those are bad words when it comes to that. All right, so I'm going to jump back over here.
Yeah, you may. I know I put some language in the chat there. I mean, I would just on self provisions make sure you say, fiber or other high speed technology, and then on some of the
Yep.
things that Scott was showing earlier with the strands and stuff, you may even have to say, for fiber solutions, we would prefer 6 strands of fiber. Phrasing it that way, kind of implying like it doesn't have to be fiber, when in fact that's probably what you really want. At
Yep.
least you're showing. And I know I had one that even said like for lease solutions, we're seeking a contract of X number of years. For lease solutions, we expect you to be on site to troubleshoot in, this much time, et cetera. Even though in their example, it was all on one campus and they really didn't want to choose a lease solution. They still put all.
Yeah, and that's all a part, Jody, you're right, of making sure that you've done your due diligence, because if that, for whatever reason, if that least lit solution had been the winner of the procurement, then it would have been very helpful to have already had that information in your RFP, so that you're assured that the provisions that you are making, or the conditions, the technical specs, that's the word I'm looking for, the technical specs that you need to have are going to be met by the provider that ultimately wins. All right, so let's talk a little bit about RFPs. The Form 470 and RFPs should provide enough information to solicit comprehensive proposals from your service providers, but not so much information that the applicant states or implies a preference. This is exactly what we've been talking about, for the particular connectivity solution, a particular construction route, or a particular method of construction. So you want it to be broad enough to catch a lot of fish in your net, but you want to be specific enough that you can get mostly the kind of fish that you want. So you want to be careful about how you cast the net. If that analogy really works. I'm not sure that it stands too much scrutiny, but I think in a general sense, that probably should give you a sense of what it means. If you are posting an RFP for multiple service types, make certain that your RFP addresses all of the broadband solution services for which you are seeking bids, and make sure that it does not indicate a preference for one over the other, just as Jody was saying a moment ago. And although E-rate rules do not specifically require applicants to prepare a separate RFP for eligible services, applicants who are looking for leased dark fiber or self-provision networks, or anything of the other option, will need to upload an RFP in Epic. So RFPs are required. There are a couple of, by the way, when all is done here, I'm going to send to the KEs so that they can deliver out to you all a copy of this presentation, as well as some of the, a couple of the resources that I'm going to share with you. One of which is this one right here. This is some funds for learning. And by the way, when I use these and I mention these, I am not putting in a plug for these folks in any way, shape, or form. It's just that this happens to be a resource that can be helpful for you, and so I want you to know that it's available and that it's that could be helpful for you. This this item, or this document, sort of outlines the requirements that your RFP is well advised to have included in it. Okay, so these are recommendations. These are not requirements from USAC. Okay, this is provided by Fund. This particular document is provided by Funds for Learning, and these are their recommendations for what you should consider including in your RFP. So I'm not going to spend too much time, but you can see there that you want to make sure that your potential vendor has some USF experience and knowledge. They understand the documentations that are necessary. And then when it comes to when it comes to what you ask for them, you want to make sure that you ask for all sorts of different information, bits and pieces, including when your services are going to be when services are going to occur. Let's see, we got whether you're going to be seeking SPY or bear as your options. There's some recommended timelines here, items on damages and what kinds of things should be contained in your RFP and your contract going forward. So I would encourage you to take a look at that again. We will send that out along with the information, or excuse me, the presentation, and then also this is a document that was put together by Education Superhighway. They are no longer really spending too much time in dabbling in the E-rate world, and now they are actually spending more of their time looking at the Affordable Connectivity Program, ACP. But nevertheless, a few years back, they actually created this a template that you can use that will help you to make sure that you're including all of the things that are really important to include within any RFP. This can be used as a take a piece out and put in the names. There's some school district name. They've really built this as a true template where you can just sort of copy and paste, cut and replace kind of approach to it. I would encourage you to take a look at this, to go through it and see. You can see here that they talk about, for example, if you want the special construction payment plan, annual or monthly payments, how over how many years. Simple things like the number of years of your contract. How many years of contract do you want to be? How many years of service do you want to fall under this particular contract? How many extensions do you want? Extensions. How many extensions can you have, and how long can they be, or how long do you want them to be? Those contract extensions are important. If you want to have the flexibility at the end of the contract to renew the contract for an additional year, you need to make sure that that's stipulated not only in your contract, but also in your RFP. So if you are asking for something if you want to have the option to extend, you need to make sure that it is included. There was something else I was thinking about there. Terms contract. Jody, I think you mentioned you had something with respect to annual contract extensions and so on and so forth.
So yeah, I was wondering if this was a good time to jump in. You kind of
Sure.
hit a real world situation. This has actually happened in a few of my districts, and I wanted to bring this up because honestly, I'm a little scared that I'm not providing good guidance. And so, scenario is a district is seeking new contract for lease services. As districts often do, they wanted a multi-year contract and wanted to have some voluntary extensions so that they could avoid having to go through this hassle too often. As you're aware, what happens is once we go through this process and a district evaluates the proposals, they select their winning provider. There is a contract that gets signed before you file the 471. And what I've had happen in a few cases now is that contract, I'll use my air quotes here, that contract that the provider is sending back is really kind of a service order. And so on a couple of these, what I've had happen is the service order will reference a term of, say, 60 months. And so the district may have in their RFP said, I want a 5-year contract with a couple of 5-year extensions because they got a really good rate and they really like this provider. And so but now what USAC coming back and saying is, well, because the contract you've provided only references a 5-year term, then you're going to have to go back out to bid in 5 years.
Yep.
So I'm assuming our guidance would be that if you're going to have voluntary extensions, then whatever signed contract you get with your winning provider, make sure you reference all of those extensions in the signed document. Does that sound
That is
like what we're saying?
that is absolutely correct. That is absolutely correct. USAC FCC rules on the program do not allow for what they call evergreen contracts. That's another thing that, the example you gave, Jody, you said, we had the contract for 60 months. That's good. I mean, that's great that at least, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, we still had a small handful of districts that had a contract that never had any specific end date, and that was problematic. And that's because this program as a whole is focused on and built upon competitive bidding, and so they do want to see their applicants every so often going out to rebid these contracts. Why? Because as we know, speeds tend to get higher and cost tends to go down on these things. So they insist that every contract have a clearly spelled out contract end date. If you want to have optional extensions, you may include them in the contract, but even those must be absolutely specifically spelled out, how many and for how long. And that through that enumeration, it allows you to identify a specific drop dead. This is the very last possible contract date. And as long as you have that, as far as that specific requirement is concerned, you're in good shape. But you are correct, Jody.
And I think where I was messing up is because, again, it seems like UTSAC stresses different things over time. And so, using my example, I'm giving you actual numbers from a district. They wanted a 5-year contract with 2 5-year extensions. So ideally it would have gone out for 15 years, but they get this ridiculously low rate. They just wanted to lock it in. Well, they didn't want to initially put 15 years on the contract terms, because then it looks like you're exercising a 15-year contract. And so they thought, right, well, USAC may ding us for that, but they're now dinging you for not referencing anything beyond the initial 5 years. And so it's just something we got to be yep, clear on, because in this example, I'm probably going to tell that district, the safe moves to go out and rebid and get them to sign something that references the longer terms, because this is something they're really looking for.
That's exactly right. If it is not in both the RFP and the resulting contract, it's not valid as far as USAC is concerned. So, yeah, I agree with you totally, Jody. That's absolutely the way that you want to pursue that. That would be my recommendation. Yes, as much as a hassle it might be, go back out, and then your new contract, you can ensure that it contains those provisions.
Hey, I've got one other one at the end when you open it up to general questions. I've got another real world scenario that's
okay.
Okay. So you let me know. Thanks.
All right, sounds good. I'm not going to belabor this further, but this template does provide some really good. It gets pretty deep in terms of the technical kinds of requirements that you can include in your RFP. So they talk about 0.25% packet loss, latency, jitter, all those kinds of things. They get pretty deep into it. So I would encourage you to take a look at this as well. And again, I will throw this out there for distribution so that you all can have a copy of it and use it to guide you, if nothing else. I do encourage you to not just do the copy and cut and replace approach to it. I would say that you want to make sure that you know ins and outs, the ins and outs meet your specific requirements locally, rather than something that somebody thought, well, this might be a good example, because that's really what this is. It's a template, but it's really a sample that should guide your work, rather than being the be all and end all of your RFP. All righty. So we'll talk about cost effectiveness. Applicants are required to demonstrate that they selected the most cost-effective service offering. When you consider bids for the fiber options, cost effectiveness should always include a comprehensive explanation of the cost breakdown of the chosen service option over the other available service options. You need to make sure that you have included an evaluation of expected useful life of the facility and compare the combined upfront and recurring costs associated with that service. And if you're considering a dark fiber option, this would include, for example, comparing the charges associated with leasing the fiber and the costs for modulating equipment and maintenance and operations costs when you compare that to the cost of a leased lit fiber option. So when you look at leased lit, that includes pretty much everything, and you're paying a single monthly cost. When you get to looking at the dark fiber or the self-provisioned, you have other costs, the maintenance and operations, equipment, break fix, any kinds of those kinds of considerations also need to be factored into the total cost of the lease, and then that total amount divided by the number of months of the contract would allow you to then compare total cost monthly, or you could use it. I mean, you could do it annually as well. It's annual or monthly, whichever you divide it by is really neither here nor there, as long as you're dividing it by the same amount of time. Same thing with the self-provision. You have all of that. I mean, you cover the cost of everything, so you have to factor that into how you came up with the total cost of the service that you're going to be obtaining under that self-provisioned option. So your time period must be defensible and aligned with the applicant's anticipated use of the assets. So if you figure, oh well, we might compare, if we buy a network, if we pay for a self-provisioned network now, and we anticipate that that's going to last for 20 years, then you need to compare that 20-year comparison across both your self-provision network as well as the leased option the lit option and the dark fiber option. Your decisions must have a tangible basis and the results should be reasonable. Those are kind of broad terms and they haven't really been well defined, but tangible meaning, something you can actually, put your finger on and say, yes, here's a good real world example, like Jody was saying, or you want it to be something that is in actuality or something that is reasonable within the life expectancy of the service that you're procuring. And then you would need to include any explanations on any assumptions you made, like I said, expected useful life, the frequency of equipment refreshes. I say that that is included in this discussion because if you were looking, for example, at a 20-year life expectancy for the fiber that you are hoping to do self-provisioned, it's reasonable to expect that 2, if not 3 times within that 20-year period, you will need to refresh your equipment in order to continue to provide the level of service that's needed for any of your locations. So you need to make sure that those refresh costs are also factored into the overall cost of either annual or monthly that you're going to use to compare with your options that might come in from vendors that are proposing lit or dark fiber.
And they will ask. You are so right on that.
Oh, yes, they will.
So,
Yes,
I've had that specifically. That's, again, real world stuff here. So we're just talking about what really happens. I had a district that was wanting dark fiber, and they knew that they had not factored in replacement costs for electronics. And literally the reviewer's like, well, show me where you when you evaluated dark versus lit, show me where you factored that in. And they didn't have any documentation that they could give them. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure that didn't end very well either. Okay, so similar, we've kind of talking about this already. You're going to want to show line item detail levels on any charges related to the service. You can work with your service provider to understand and be able to explain the reasonableness or need for any associated costs, so that you can break down, pole make ready costs, number of splices, and if there are any handholds or vaults that need to be either put in place or leased in terms of, or the rights of use need to be paid for. And then a map that will show GIS data that is part of the cost per foot evaluation. Because they will ask you a cost per foot, particularly on the they will ask for that for dark and self-provisioned fiber. And then once again, the time frame in which the investment of USF will yield cost savings. So, if you are anticipating or you are selecting a self-provisioned network, you will be able to you need to be able to show how long it will take before you are now saving money versus the other two options of leased or lit or leased dark fiber. There are some things in terms of cost allocation, things that you cannot ask for funding for. And if they are included in the overall costs that are presented to you by your bidder, then you will need to make sure that they are pulled out from your funding requests when you get to your Form 471. So you have to make sure that you are only using E-rate funds to pay for services and product used by eligible entities for an eligible purpose, primarily educational purpose, or specifically in the state of Kentucky, you need to be aware that if you have a facility that is dedicated to pre-K, that would not be considered an eligible location. Any services that would go to that location, particularly on dark fiber, on any of them, because you're not eligible for leased, dark, lit, dark, or self-provision. So all of that would have to be pulled from your total funding request when you get to the Form 471. So costs associated with fiber installed to be used by an ineligible entity, as I just mentioned. And then you want to make sure that you're including the costs above and beyond, or excluding the costs above what would be incurred if the fiber required to serve the applicant were installed. The cost allocation requires a clear delineation of costs. It must be based on a reasonable, tangible basis that reaches a realistic result. And the cost allocations must be supported by some form of documentation. You need to be able to show your work. Let's get all like math class back when we were kids. You need to be able to show how you came up with the information that you are presenting to them. Fiber and facilities installed as a part of a self-provision network must be owned by the school and may not be used by other entities. It can't be resold or even loaned out. You can't let another entity piggyback on that communication or those connections because that entity would not be an eligible entity. Special construction charges are only eligible for support if the new fiber is lit by the end of the funding year. That's pretty straightforward. Any excess strands, ones that are not going to be lit, they can be installed for future use, but you cannot charge the program to cover the cost of strands that are not going to be lit once service is started. That having been said, we're really just talking about the fiber itself, and we're not talking about the digging or the stringing on the poles. It costs to dig one way or another, whether you're putting 12 in, whether you're putting 48 in, if you're putting 128 in, it really doesn't matter. you are just going to be paying, you still have to dig or string it on the poles in order to make those connections. What you can't include in that are the number of strands that are not going to be lit up for the use of the district during once you've got things going. If you're going to have excess strands, they must be paid for out of district funds. We've got a couple of examples. I'll go through these really quick. Least lit or dark fiber provider installs 12 strands and wants to add 36 additional strands for its own ineligible use, resulting in additional labor costs and plant costs. The result, 36 additional fiber strands and the associated incremental costs of labor or plant costs above and beyond what would be incurred by the 12, if only the 12 strands were installed, must be allocated out of that funding request. And we're getting into a little bit of the Form 471 kind of details here, but it is something worth noting as you go forward. Another example here, runs in a self-provision network, and they're only going to light 12 within the funding year. The remaining 36 strands are going to be reserved for future use. The cost associated with those excess fiber strands, whether must be factored out, but the special construction costs are still eligible in full. It's only the additional 36 strands that would have to be factored out. Here's the example of 48 strands in a self-provision network, and some of them will be used by another entity. And in this case, this funding request is going to be denied. Self-provision networks must be owned by eligible schools and libraries, and they may not resell or even allow other entities that are ineligible to use those services. So I think we kind of touched on this here. The 6 months prior to the start of the funding year is when you can begin your installation. You have to make sure that you meet the following conditions. Construction begins after the selection of the service provider pursuant to a valid competitive bidding process. That also means that you would still have filed a Form 470. So if construction began on January 1, you can do that as long as you've already gone through the Form 470 process. You've waited your at least 28 days, and then you've gone through the proper bid evaluation process as well. Once that's been done, then yeah, things can start. But once again, as we've pointed out, you are taking on the risk that if your funding request on your Form 471 gets denied, you will have to cover the full cost of that build. And then the actual service start date for the recurring service is on or after the start of the funding year. Service delivery deadlines. Your service delivery has to be completed, and it must be in use by the end of the relevant funding year. So for the funding year that we're going into, everything has to be in place and operational by June 30th of 2025. If this June 30th deadline is not met, the recurring charges will not be eligible for support under the program rules. This is specifically going to impact primarily dark fiber services. So if things aren't put in place first, you're going to have those recurring charges associated with the dark fiber. There is no extension available for recurring charges, so you will get no support for those recurring charges because technically you should not have incurred them at that point. Applicants may not receive E-rate support for any recurring charges incurred before the funding year. We mentioned that previously. You can only receive E-rate support for recurring charges within the funding year for which you are applying. You cannot receive E-rate support for recurring charges for leased dark fiber until it is lit. So if you need to have network equipment in order to light your fiber, only until that equipment is installed and that fiber is lit up. That is the point at which you would then be eligible for E-rate support for those recurring charges. And you may not receive E-rate support for recurring charges associated with a self-provision network until it is constructed and in use. Now, it is possible to have a self-provision network and then have recurring charges. It's rare, but there may be recurring charges associated with things like managed internal broadband services, which those will not be eligible if they're not being, those recurring charges will not be eligible because your network wasn't operational at the time, and maintenance and operations requires that to be in place and operational first. Special construction service delivery deadlines. Like we said, special construction charges are only eligible when it's lit within the same funding year as the rest of the funding request. And if the network is constructed and is in use by the end of the same funding year as the funding requests. There is such thing as a special construction deadline extension. You may request a one-year extension to complete special construction and light the fiber, or put it in place and start using your self-provision network if another technology is employed. So if you, the applicant, can demonstrate that construction was unavoidably delayed, weather, or I don't know, things more recently, like, I don't know, worldwide pandemics, those kinds of things can result in delays, and those unavoidable delays can result in your eligibility for a special construction deadline extension. That having been said, you need to make sure that you are requesting your extension prior to the end of the funding year for which you initially requested support. In other words, you asked for support for the 24-25 school year, and you then realize, oh, our special construction is not done, and it's not going to be done before the end of the funding year. If you wait until after the end of the funding year to request an extension, you will not get it, and you will pay the full amount out of your own pocket. So just be aware that if an extension is necessary, you must ask for the extension prior to the deadline. Same thing goes for invoicing. I'll just throw that out there as well. Anytime you're invoicing USAC and asking for the money, that has to be done prior to the deadline by which those funds are requested. Okay, so what can the service provider do during the application and review process? After the competitive bid process has concluded and you have a contract in place, the service provider can then assist you in preparing your Form 471 and your funding requests. You can speak directly to them and respond to, and they can help you respond to PIA, program integrity assurance folks when you get those standard questions. And by the way, Jody alluded to it earlier. They will ask questions, particularly if you are going to be asking for self-provision networks. I have seen on a number of occasions a litany of questions that come as a result of requesting self-provisioned in the first place. I think the last one I saw was like 5 or 6 pages long. It is intensive. You can, when you get that set of questions, go directly to your service provider and go, hey, help me present this to, help me respond to these questions, because in all likelihood, there are going to be some questions on there that you're probably not going to be able to answer without their assistance.
Well, and I think one of the key points, Scott, you've got it pulled up on the slide right there, is that top bullet after the bid process has concluded. Yep. So there's a time when you can't show favoritism to vendors, which is during the bid and evaluation process. But then once the selection's made, All of this stuff holds true to his point. Like they can help you with the application. They can help you with review questions because you've already chosen them. You've already said they are the most cost-effective solution for you. So.
Yep. Okay. And I think we are kind of to the wrap. So, Jody, you had a real world example that you wanted to bring up?
Man, I do. And it is kind of related to tracks. And if you slap my hand and say we got to take it offline, so be it. But this is real world stuff. It may impact some people on this call. So I'm going to bring it up anyway and let you calm me down if needed.
Okay.
This past year, I've had a couple of districts that have gone through a WAN rebid, and they got responses from their incumbent, and they got responses from a new provider, and went through the evaluation. New provider was more cost effective, had done business in other districts, and they're like on fire to pick the new provider. So we file with the new provider, services to start July 1. July 1 rolls around, new provider doesn't have all the sites connected yet. And I know we've probably done some things on our end to deal with this because we're changing providers. And so my question would be, is there any relief that they have now or anything they could have done to protect themselves? Because the dilemma they're in is they had to maintain kind of on a month-to-month basis, they maintain the connections with the old provider that they no longer have E-rate support for. So the cost has greatly increased, and the district is, stress is greatly increasing because the new provider, for various reasons, hasn't been able to get all the sites connected as of July 1 as they promised.
The question I would have is, to start with, is were all of the extensions, if there were any extensions, what was the true end of life of the contract actually ended at that point?
I could double check. I believe it was in both cases. That's why they were rebidding to begin with. But either way, they filed for no E-rate services for the current funding year with the incumbent provider because they knew that contract was expiring. They weren't going to do business with them after June 30th. They were moving over to the new provider. It's just the new provider didn't get their stuff in place in time.
There is a way. There are a couple of methods that can be used to account for that. What that would ultimately
have done? Would they have had to do that at the time of filing?
Yes, and that's the key thing really involved in all of that is that.
And so that may be the kind of thing that, not that we necessarily covered today, but at some point I want to find a way to try to protect future districts from dealing with what mine are dealing with right now, because this does happen occasionally. Where for reasons good or bad, the new provider doesn't get everything connected like we thought they were going to. And now, unfortunately, my districts are left without any recourse because you can't go back after the filing window and ask for any E-rate help on anything. So,
yeah.
Sorry, didn't mean to.
That's okay. Like I said, there's a couple of techniques that can. There's one in particular that I'm thinking of that basically is what we have done at the state level at the consortium to address the same kind of issues associated with our switch over to ENA.
Is that kind of where you establish multiple mechanisms and then go back and cost allocate out and readjust Form 500, on given this is okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, we may want to, because it does, and Clayton mentioned in the chat, I mean, this does come up occasionally. And I'm just, I don't know, it's not something I have featured in any discussions I've had, but after it's happened a couple of times now, it may be something we want to cover. It's kind of a just in case thing to keep people from, I mean, I've got one district in a real spot right now. And we can talk about that offline.
Okay. Were there any other questions? I haven't looked at the chat, so we might still have some questions here.
Man, Corey just threw a good one in there off of my question about wondering if they could have put in their contract terms that the new provider has to pay any fees associated with maintaining existing services if they can't deliver in time. In hindsight, I'm wondering if something would have been an hour.
I like that approach. That's
I mean,
not
that's
honestly,
not an E-rate thing, but that is something that, like, if you had some legal binding thing, because that's where we are. Is I got a district looking to, to make somebody responsible for this money they're going to be out. But
yeah, that is one way that the contractually you can make sure that your backside, so to speak, is covered. Would the template reference portions of it would, Jason? Portions of it would, not the entire thing, because I don't think the entire thing is necessarily. I don't think it's focused specifically on self-provision networks, but I'm certain that there are elements of it that will be helpful.
And really gray areas. I know we're being recorded. I mean, obviously, one advantage of things in Kentucky is that we do things in a similar fashion. If you work through your KE, we might be able to get you an idea of an RFP that another district used when they were seeking self-provision services. Not to say that you should copy anything word for word. Obviously, your circumstances differ. I've seen people put, Google map drawings of the property and kind of lay some things out in some detail that you would have to make unique to you. But we could probably get you some things to help out if you ask Mike or whoever to see if we can get something to you.
Yeah, I'm sure we could.
Also say, I know, Scott, like conversations like this, we have on multiple occasions had little conference calls with a district to talk about their specific situation. There's a line that we can't cross. Obviously, we can't do evaluations for districts. We can't say whether, contract language is acceptable or not. We're not attorneys, and I tell people all the time, we're not USAC. We don't give out the money and come take it back. So, but we can, it's the insurance commercial, right? A thing or two because you've seen a thing or two. So we've managed to leverage Scott and Caprice in that fashion and just say, hey, let's at least talk through this and see if a second set of eyes help out. And so that's something that you all have been more than willing to do. Appreciate that as always.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I was going to put in a plug for that very thing in that you all as the KEs have a really solid understanding of what's happening on the ground, so to speak, in your districts. And so you guys are a great resource for folks going through this process. And on top of that, yeah, anytime that you have any questions, your concerns, I'm just not sure about how I should approach this. Like Jody said, give us a call. Let's set up a Teams meeting or just a phone call, and let's make sure that you are operating from an optimal position. Positioning yourself to be as successful as possible, and we're more than willing to spend that time and help you get through that process. If there are no further questions, I will bring it to a close and just simply say thank you very much for attending. And please don't, as I said, don't hesitate to give me a call, drop me an email, call your KE, drop them an email. We'll be happy to work with you as best we can and help you hopefully be as successful as possible in this process. It can be it can be daunting and can be cumbersome, but we want to make you help make you as successful as possible in all of this.